Welcome to Lecture 9 for English 421Y. In this lecture, I want to focus on the research process for gathering sources to use in your incident analysis report. Unlike other reports you might have written, the range of sources you are permitted to use for this project will be much broader and can include everything from other technical reports and white papers to newspapers, blogs, documentary films, journal articles, social media posts, infographics, magazine articles, and much more. Not only is it okay to use non-traditional sources like blog posts or tweets, depending on your topic, this might actually produce the most reliable and relevant sources of information. The critical point is that you need to be prepared to defend your choices and explain why a particular source deserves to be cited. Not just what information you got from it, but why that source meets your criteria for credible, unbiased, and interesting sources of information. In this lecture, I will focus on 4 strategies that will help you get the most out of your research this unit. In addition, I will reference a document that I added to Blackboard titled Incident Analysis Example, which walks through a topic that I chose back in 2015 to illustrate the research processes for this particular project. I also strongly suggest looking at the sample projects from students in previous semesters to get a better sense of what kinds of reports and information we're dealing with. So as I wrote, or as I said, there's an incident analysis example in the Blackboard folder that kind of walks through the process. I'm not going to read this, but I will point towards specific sections of it. So the first thing I did while researching this topic was I began my process as broad as possible, but I quickly narrowed it based on what I found in the initial sources. So looking at the example that I posted to Blackboard, you can see that I began my research into the Gold King mine disaster by looking at Google News and Wikipedia, both of which pointed me toward other sources and helped me decide what aspects of the incident to research further. It's important to note that I didn't stop here, and if I had written a full report, these initial sources would not have been cited. Why? It's because they are part of the critical early stages of research, where I am more concerned with learning and asking questions than with finding things to cite. As I see it, research like this often occurs in roughly 3 stages: pre-search, narrowing research, and then final sources. So looking at Wikipedia or CNN or whatever, those are great for pre-search. Pre-search is a dumb title, but it helpfully describes the earliest stage of the process when you aren't quite sure of your topic or focus and find sources that help you decide what to research next. Typically, these sources are never referenced, but give you the gist and point you to better sources. In my example, I began with an article in the Chicago Tribune that came up when I did a Google search. This article was really helpful because it gave me a snapshot, an overview of what happened, showed me some pictures, and allowed me to kind of get a sense of what the accident actually was. The Wikipedia page was also really useful because it gave me a very specific overview of the entire incident, as well as links down here at the bottom, links to references. So this is where I actually found a number of the documents that I ended up using. I don't need to cite Wikipedia if I find the sources that Wikipedia cites, nor can I quote Wikipedia, but I can move to the actual sources of information. A lot of these you'll notice are newspapers, magazines, and things like that. Narrowing research begins once you have a topic and begin moving away from broader general sources and toward more specialized information created by experts, including primary sources by those with first-hand experience. As the name implies, narrowing sources help you focus on useful information, decide what is important or relevant, and cut out anything that doesn't meet your criteria. While they can be cited, they often point towards other information that is more useful. For my research on the Gold King mine, an article in the Denver Post ended up being one of my most useful narrowing sources. It helped me narrow my research by pointing me toward an internal EPA report, As you read this, you can see here it says, the news came as 92 pages of internal documents were released by the EPA. As I was reading that, I thought, oh, well, let me click on that link and see what the EPA actually said. Obviously, it's a 92-page report, and so it's pretty substantial. But you can see, once I found that report, it led me to other reports, such as this summary report. That's a summary of the larger 92-page report released by the EPA. And this gave me a much more specific and detailed, but also accessible way to look at this information, including a lot of background information and things that I would not have otherwise been able to piece together only by looking at newspaper articles or Wikipedia. It also provided me key terms, such as the Animas River and mine blowout. Gave me the idea to focus on the long-term impact of mining in the Animas River area, and helped me find additional sources of information. Each of these points led to another deeper and more specific round of research that, again, I would not have done if I had stayed at the more surface-level newspaper articles. Final sources, then, are those that are specialized and present a perspective or angle that is not available anywhere else. It goes deeper than you would find in a newspaper article or a blog post, a newspaper article or a magazine article. Most importantly, these sources have often been evaluated or determined to be credible, useful, and interesting. These are the sources that you actually want to cite in your report, and they're often impossible to find without first doing pre-search and narrowing research. With the Gold King mine research, for example, the final sources that I simply would not have found without considerable legwork were the Bureau of Reclamation's technical evaluation of the Gold King mine incident, the Animas River Stakeholder Group website, and the High Country News Post, When Our River Turned Orange. These three sources, one of them a technical report from the EPA, the Environmental Protection Association, EPA. One, the Animas River Stakeholders Group, a collection of businesses, individuals, landowners, state and federal agencies, and environmental agencies. And then finally, the High Country News, a blog that's maintained by people who live in that area and that actually went out and took pictures of the incident and were able to include history and discussion that is not anywhere else. So these three sources all gave me so much more information than I was able to get from the Chicago Tribune, the Denver Post, CNN, or Wikipedia. These sources did not show up on my initial Google News searches. They were not cited in my first round of pre-search, and they didn't show up on the first few pages of Google. But they were the best evidence of the argument I would make if I were to write a full incident analysis report. So thinking about research as three interlocking steps shows that you can't just move from pre-search to final sources without first finding the sources that help you get more specialized and detailed. Similarly, you can't narrow your sources if you don't first start with pre-search. And then you can't arrive at quality final sources unless you go through this entire process. So I like to think of the research process as this image. So pre-search leads to narrowing, which leads to final sources. You can't skip the middle. You can't start at final sources. You have to do all three in order to arrive at the quality of information that you want. Now, thinking about research as these interlocking steps shows that you can't move from one to the other. It's not always a perfect linear process, however. This image of three locking arrows shows the importance of doing all three stages, but sometimes you might begin with pre-search, start narrowing, and then realize, actually, I need to go back to pre-search. I need to find more. This topic isn't good enough, or there's not enough information available yet. You might get all the way to final sources and then realize, you know what? I don't have enough to write about. I need to go back to narrowing. I need to look at broader Google searches and take another path. Or you might end up narrowing and then deciding that you need to use some final sources, but you also need to restart pre-search. There's a lot of different paths that you can take. Research often involves multiple instances of each of these three. It's not a single straight process. Okay, so the second suggestion that I have is to evaluate every source. You get in the habit of evaluating sources before using them rather than using everything you find. Simply put, not everything you find should be cited. And when you include a source in your research, you aren't simply using the information it contains. You are also making a statement about the credibility, veracity, or truthfulness and relevance of its contents. You don't always have to agree with your sources, and it's certainly possible to reference something and be critical of it. However, if you hold a source up as evidence, then you are also vouching for its credibility and connecting your professional ethos, that is your credibility, to that of the authors. So if you select a source and you don't evaluate it and you just use it because it was the first thing that came up on Google search, and then it turns out that that source was not credible, maybe they lied, maybe they were extremely biased, maybe it was poorly written and omitted information or whatever, that falls on you, especially when you leave the university and become a professional. If you, as a representative of a company or an organization, if you use a source and it turns out that that source was lying or that source was incorrect or whatever, you are responsible. You can't just say, oh, well, my source. You were responsible for evaluating, for vetting that source and making sure that that source was appropriate before using it. If you have any reservations about a source, where it came from, what it contains, who created it, when it was published, how it has been received by others, etc., then you should perform a cost-benefit analysis and decide what value it provides. An example from my research of a source that I evaluated is the article on the Animas River Stakeholder Group from the Your Colorado Water blog. So when I first saw this, I was like, Your Water Colorado blog? This seems kind of dinky, kind of small. It was the first mention of the Animas River Stakeholder Group. It was the first mention of a lot of these sort of environmental organizations that I'd found anywhere. This article is from a blog and has a clear anti-mining bias. That is, it's against the mining industry, which was partially responsible for the cause of the leak. However, I chose to use it because it offers a perspective absent in any of the other documents I used, particularly the EPA and Bureau of Reclamation reports, which barely mention the community impacted by the release of wastewater into the Animas River. If someone challenged my choice to include the Your Colorado Water blog as a source, I would be prepared to explain why I believe it is credible and how I am using it in order to balance viewpoints of my sources. Because it is written from the perspective of local citizens, same thing with the High Country News article, When Our River Turned Orange, because these two articles are written from the perspective of people who actually live in the region that was affected, it allows me to balance the national coverage and then the more government-oriented perspectives that I'd found in other sources. My third suggestion is to find contrasting views. As I just mentioned, you're going to have biased sources. That's impossible when you're doing something that's controversial or something that has a lot of different views on it, such as this the Gold King mine disaster. An important but perhaps counterintuitive element of research is to seek out contrasting views, particularly when dealing with a topic that has led to clearly established political positions or factions that might lead to biased information. If you include only sources from one side of an issue that has multiple sides, you can be accused of perpetuating the biases of these sources. That is, if I only included the government sources in my report, people would say, oh, well, clearly you agree with the government and you agree with the mining companies and you don't agree with the citizens who live in the county that was affected and who themselves disagree with the government. So if you contrast multiple perspectives in different sources, However, you avoid the pitfall of bias and allow your analysis to focus on why and how different viewpoints developed, then you can use multiple biased sources. So you're not just using one biased source, you're using multiple sources, each one that potentially has a bias to it. You're thus avoiding saying, this is the one that is true, and instead saying, here are 3 different views, and leaving it up to the reader to piece together which one is true. Now, you might ultimately present a perspective and then say, actually, it turns out that this one, was full of crap or whatever, but you're still presenting it. You're still presenting these 3 views and allowing the reader to see the analysis that you performed to arrive at your evaluation. So many of the national sources that I found rightfully blamed the EPA for the Gold King mine disaster, but many sources seized a political opportunity to critique the EPA, a who watches the watchman argument, if you will. Or they make Gold King sound like an isolated incident that could have easily been prevented. The blog post from the High Country News argues that this particular spill is bad, but it's one of many spills. This isn't the first time that the EPA has done this. This isn't the first time that the mining companies have done this. As they say, nor is it the worst. So these 2 viewpoints, the EPA is wrong, and yeah, the EPA is wrong, but it's more complex than that. They both would exist simultaneously in the report that I would write about this. I would contrast each, and while they both have biases, by analyzing them, I avoid simply repeating their arguments without criticizing them, without adding my own commentary. My final suggestion is to record and cite everything. It's important to develop productive habits for locating information that will transfer to your chosen field or major. While research varies widely across disciplines, in almost every career or industry, you need to be able to collect and present information. This is why it's invaluable to come up with your own system for taking notes, citing information from sources, and collecting research that you've found while in the middle of conducting research. You don't necessarily have to create a document such as this where I listed my secondary sources and primary sources, but having some document, especially as a collaborative group, having some source where you put all of your sources, whether it's a Google Drive folder, a Dropbox folder, or whatever, the group page on Blackboard, or a Slack channel. Having a place where everything is collected allows you to keep track of everything. You also want to collect more sources than you actually need. Let's say in my final report, I cite 8 sources, but I use the first 8 sources that I cite. That means I'm not going into narrowing research. I'm not getting at those deeper sources that I talked about that were so reliable and so useful. If you use only the first 8 sources that you're going to find on Google or wherever, you're inevitably going to have a limited perspective. For this project, I might find 20 sources and only use 8. I might find 30 sources and use 15. But if I find more than I need, then I need to make a logical choice about what I'm including and what I'm not. Okay, so I've mentioned collaboration just a second ago. I want to conclude this lecture with some suggestions about conducting research and writing a report collaboratively. There's a collaboration guide located down here on Blackboard where I distinguish between 2 types of writing. Cooperative writing, where everyone works on separate parts and one person edits all of the parts together, and collaborative writing, where everyone works on different sections at every stage of the writing process, so that no one person is responsible for one entire section of the document, and no one person is responsible for any phase of the process, whether it's research or editing. The primary benefit of truly collaborative writing is that everyone looks at every part of the project. One person might write the introduction, another person might then read it and add more to it, a third person might then edit and proofread it to make sure that it's finalized. I find that most groups are very good at breaking the document up into sections. For example, person 1 does the intro and conclusion, person 2 does chapter 1, etc. But many people struggle with how to handle revision, rewriting, editing, and proofreading. These are more holistic things. So if you divide the report up into 3 sections, who then is responsible for proofreading the entire document? People might proofread and edit their individual sections, but that can often create the problem of multi-voicing. Multi-voicing is when each section sounds like it was written by a different person, because it was. Single voicing means the entire report sounds like one person wrote it, even if 4 people wrote it. Similarly, you should never assign research to just one person. If everyone is involved in finding sources that the whole group will use, then you will get a greater variety and volume of information. That is, rather than only being able to cite the 5 sources that you found, you can cite the 20 sources that all 4 of you found, or whatever. Simply put, all of your names are on the report. All of your names will be on the title page. So everyone should be researching, writing, and editing for the entire report. That was so-and-so's job, or that wasn't my section, are not excuses when you are a professional on a job, so they're not acceptable excuses here. While it might be more work, the finished product will be far more cohesive and consistent as a result of strong communication, collaboration, and careful balancing of responsibilities. As such, I'm asking each group to submit a version of the table that I've put on the collaboration guide and included in the transcript of this video lecture. This table shows how your group will divide the work so that everyone is revising, rewriting, and editing sections that they also did not write. The table asks you to fill in each specific section of the report and indicate who is responsible for it at each stage of the writing process. For instance, here you can see the executive summary at the planning stage. So early on, person 1 is going to do that. The introduction, person number 2 and 3 are going to plan for it. Person 3 is then going to draft it. Once it's done, person 1 is going to revise it, and then person 2, who was involved in the planning stage but didn't do any of the writing or drafting, is then going to edit it and proofread it. The table asks you to fill in this information. You can modify it to fit your own needs and revise it to include the actual structure of your report. So you might put different headings or different things in this first column. That might change, but the general layout with columns indicating stages in the writing process, the planning stage, the drafting stage, the revising stage, and the editing stage should remain the same. And just to be clear, planning is before you start writing, organizing, brainstorming, research, that kind of thing. Drafting is when you are writing. Revising is when you are rewriting. And then editing is when you are going back through and doing final editing for organization, proofreading for grammar, and then just reading to make sure that it's single-voiced and cohesive. That should remain the same, that general structure. You're going to send me a copy of your table prior to my conference with your group, which will be held on campus or via video chat between Monday, April 23rd and Wednesday, April 25th. We will determine that time ahead of time, so you'll know your group's deadline for having this table done. And I encourage you to start doing the table from the very beginning. In addition to ensuring that everyone contributes to all sections and stages of the development process, you also need to ensure that your group is setting times to meet, whether in person or via teleconferencing like Skype, Google Hangouts, or Slack. Email, text message, and GroupMe are great for communicating updates, and Slack as well, but they're a bit more limited for making important decisions. So you should decide where you're going to have a place where you can message each other. You should also decide where you're going to store all of your files in a place where everyone has access to them. So using OneDrive or using Dropbox or Google Drive or whatever. Finally, if you figure out everyone's availability and schedule meetings in advance, either in person or on campus, in person or via video, you will have less to figure out during the last few weeks of the semester when everyone's schedules are hectic. So plan out communication, plan out where you're going to store your materials, and plan out meetings at the very, very beginning of the process rather than waiting until later on when it might be too late. That's it for this lecture. Good luck as you start beginning this process and moving into the beginning of developing your report.